smart contracts. And I think one of the most interesting developments that you're going to see is related to GDP-linked bonds. Now, as you know, GDP-linked bonds, the idea has been around for quite some time, but investors are often reluctant to buy them because they think, okay, who is going to report the GDP data? Is this going to be accurate? And is the government really going to pay me based on this rule? So this has been an issue in Argentina, this has been an issue in Greece, this is an issue in Ukraine right now, where people have used these. So if you have a digital system of tracking activity in your economy, okay, so I've just expanded the space in which for my digital transactions. But if you have that digital system, and if you record it over a decentralized ledger, then you're not relying on a statistical agency to tell you what economic activity is. That's actually reported in the ledger in a way that's accessible to everyone. And you, as a government issuing debt, can design a contract that says, if the following conditions are met, then we make the payment. And if they're not met, we don't pay. That's a very credible commitment because you're linking that to the transactions that are actually taking place, as opposed to somebody's record or what some statistical office may or may not have measured correctly.
A very pleasant good morning to you all. On behalf of my fellow members of the public service, the staff of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, and the governor and staff of the Central Bank of Barbados, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this very timely and important session on how can digital currencies improve the efficiencies of the civil service. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, let me recognize the presence of the Central Bank of Barbados' distinguished guest and visiting scholar, Dr. Simon Johnson, and Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT School of Management and Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. I wish to again welcome you to Barbados and hope that you are fully enjoying the warm hospitality of our people, our weather, lovely beaches, and cuisine. I wish to recall that the governor of the People's Republic of China, the Central Bank, recently held an interview with the Chinese business magazine in which he discussed digital currencies. In this interview, he said that digital currencies will inevitably replace cash, but governments will regulate and control any digital currencies that are used as legal tender. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, digital currencies have been studied for a long time. History shows that currencies evolve as technologies and economies develop. The shift from commodity money to credit money, for example, was a natural result of the development of commerce. Cash, which is the current version of currency, is low tech. It is therefore inevitable that cash will be replaced by new products and new technologies that have greater security and production and lower costs of transaction. The rapid development of the internet and global payment systems make it necessary to issue and circulate digital currencies. Ladies and gentlemen, there are several principles that need to be adhered to in issuing digital currencies. The first is convenience and security. Second, a balance needs to be struck between protecting privacy and maintaining social order, as well as cracking down on illegal activities. In particular, digital currency should offer tools to fight money laundering and financing of terrorism. Thirdly, digital currency should facilitate the enactment of monetary policy. And fourthly, digital currency should not impact monetary sovereignty. It should be possible to convert the currencies by having controls on its convertibility. Since digital currencies can constitute a legal tender, it must be issued and controlled by the relevant monetary authority, with the issuance and circulation and transaction processes following the same management principles as traditional currencies. Ladies and gentlemen, since the early 90s in Barbados, government has sought to put policies in place to facilitate a more efficient public service through a holistic public sector reform initiative. One of these initiatives relates to the development of e-government as a tool to accelerate decision-making and other transactions. The use of digital currencies can therefore aid in this process towards making the public service of Barbados more operationally, fiscally, and monetarily efficient. In addition, digital currencies can speed up and reduce transaction costs in the channeling of financial resources in settling payments in the public service. This will certainly enhance our business facilitation and as well as the ease of doing business, which is one of the strategic objectives contained in Barbados's growth and development strategy. In this regard, and by extension, foreign-related financial transactions would be easier to undertake, thereby increasing foreign exchange reserves, earnings, as well as having a more positive impact on our NIR. The economic impact can be positive as direct foreign investment and foreign financial flows would be better facilitated. Institutions within the Barbados Revenue Authority would therefore need to enhance their information technology infrastructure to allow for payments from digital transactions, because these can significantly enhance government's revenue intake, leading to a reduction in arrears to government, and also possibly contributing to a reduction of government's fiscal deficit. So I'm very pleased that we have this session this morning to be discussed with public servants. I look forward to a fruitful discussion, and I'm going to be here to enjoy and learn from Mr. Johnson. I thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation to be here in Barbados and to talk to you this morning. And thanks for that very clear and powerful introduction. I think, well, the one reason I'm here is because I believe that digital currencies and the technology surrounding them, which I'm going to talk about, provide a great opportunity for many societies and governments around the world. And I hope that we can all participate in a global conversation between governments, between officials, with former officials like myself. I formerly worked at the International Monetary Fund, and with the private sector about how to make good use of these technologies and how to make sure that they're deployed in a way that's consistent with your overall national objectives. And so I believe this is because it's being recorded, a matter of public record, and I hope that we can you release that statement and put it out on your website in a way that could be cited by me and other people as a model and something that other governments should look at and think about. A very important part of this conversation. So my name is Simon Johnson. I am a professor at MIT, and I work at a think tank called the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. I was the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund in 2007, 2008. And I now am part of an initiative at MIT focused on digital currencies. And I want to tell you at least sort of the main contours of that part of our work, which is relevant, I think, to your interests. But I'm absolutely here to try and start a conversation with you and your colleagues about exactly what would be useful for government, what you regard as being the priorities, and what you also regard as the dangers or the things to be avoided. Because I think that we're all in the business of trying to design or shape a new global system that's emerging. And I think it's very important that all countries speak out clearly on this and articulate their interests, just as we heard from Patrick a moment ago. So let me start start off by providing you with a little bit of terminology. This is not a technical presentation in the sense of going into the computer science or the cryptography, but I do want to get a couple of terms defined for you, because just really to make sure we're on the same page. And these are terms that you hear quite a lot. You read them in the newspapers now, and you see them, people talking about them on television. One term people use is blockchain. Blockchain is a key technology component of this new alternative money system called Bitcoin. But blockchain is much more broadly of interest, I think, to all of us, beyond the Bitcoin application. That's part of one of my main points this morning. The second terminology or piece of jargon you hear is a decentralized or shared ledger. And the way to think about this is that we run most of our operations in the private sector and in the government sector today on some form of centralized database with a number of backups, but backing up a central repository, a central node in our computer networks. The decentralized ledger idea is that you wouldn't just have all your information on one database, and control of that database becomes where is the critical issue, the security of that database. Can someone go in and alter records ex post, for example? That's a big fraud concern across all kinds of activities. What you have with a shared ledger is multiple copies of that record existing at the same time on different computers, controlled by different people. And the question we're going to explore is, who would you trust to control those computers? For example, you could do it just within the Ministry of Finance. You could do it across all the other ministries on the revenue side of the government. You could do it across all government ministries. The government could do it with the central bank. You could also have trusted third parties, people who run critical national infrastructure, for example, they run networks for you, but they run their own networks. And if that network fails, that's a very big deal for the country. So telephones, for example, electricity would be another example. They may also be within that trusted perimeter. That's a key parameter we're going to talk about. All of this relates to and leads into the issue of digital cash. But digital cash is a little bit separate, and there are digital cash futures that we can imagine that don't necessarily run on decentralized ledgers. Digital cash, I'm absolutely convinced, is coming to all of us. And this just means from a consumer point of view, they're not going to be using much paper money or coins in the future. They're going to be using some digital representation of money, probably on their cell phone or whatever device replaces cell phones going forward. So our payment system will be primarily or almost entirely electronic, running on the digital records. And how these pieces fit together is what I want to talk about. And I want to focus today, as already said, on the opportunities, and maybe there are also here some risks for government. Now, there are three main alternatives that I want to lay out for you and use to focus our discussion. The first is Bitcoin, or a fully encrypted private currency. Now, that's not what I'm advocating that you adopt by any means, but it is important to talk about some of those issues, to think about the technology, and also think about the competitive threat. One reason that I'm convinced payment systems are changing already is because the existing systems run by commercial banks, primarily with and through the central bank, those systems are under a lot of competitive pressure from alternative ways of making payments, including from Bitcoin and commodity-like currencies with similar characteristics. The second piece that is also coming is permissioned blockchains, where you run a decentralized ledger of the kind that I talked about, and you use it for the transfer of assets. So this is something that big banks are already investing in around the world. They're doing it themselves in-house. They're doing it in consortiums. They're funding startups. There's a lot of money going into this. Venture capital is funding this in a parallel initiative. And you will see this. This is not a 5-year or a 10-year prospect. You will see this in the next 1 or 2 years being deployed for back office clearing and settlement of financial securities in leading markets around the world. And the reason is it has the promise is they'll save a lot of money. Those systems are legacy systems. They're extremely clunky. They're very expensive. And the issues now being discussed by central banks and security regulators, for example, in and around the Financial Stability Board, is how to facilitate or allow the development of this technology while keeping an eye, of course, on systemic stability and not encouraging or maybe not even allowing banks or anyone else to build systems that can be extremely vulnerable, either from a cybersecurity point of view or from a systemic risk, contagion set of issues, the kind of things we saw in 2008, for example. The third system, and the third alternative, and the one that I think will actually prevail, is one in which central banks move more decisively into the business of issuing digital cash. Central banks are already partially in that business. Central banks could move much more into that. I think that they have an opportunity here, and if they don't, I think that there will be some problems. So let me spend the next 15, 20 minutes on some of these key points, and then hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions and discussion. So Bitcoin, first of all, what is Bitcoin? How should you think about Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is an alternative currency. It's a currency set up by people who don't like banks and don't particularly trust government either. Instead of running their payments through any kind of centralized system, private or public, they have a decentralized way to verify that I have the funds that I say I have when I purchase something from you. And they have a very clever and so far robust system that allows the system to verify whether or not I'm double spending. I'm buying something from you, but I'm also buying something over here. The system can prevent me from doing that and make sure that you, when you're receiving my Bitcoin, you know that you can actually get those funds. It's like gold, but in a digital form. It actually has some advantages compared to gold. So gold is heavy. Gold is easy to steal. It's terribly annoying to transport. There was never, even when we ran our systems, monetary systems based on gold, there was a very big problem with small change because you can't take little flakes of gold to pay for little things in the grocery store. So that was always an issue in gold-based systems. You don't have those problems with Bitcoin. There's about the value of Bitcoin is determined by demand and supply. The market value of the total amount of Bitcoin outstanding right now is about $6 billion. There are a lot of other competing private money systems, but Bitcoin is by far the largest, about 20 times larger than the competitors. It also has a very large developer community. And you know what that means because you've seen the development of cell phones. And I notice a lot of people still using BlackBerrys in Barbados, including at the central bank. But you know that one big advantage that Apple has managed to establish and that Samsung, Google has managed to establish is big developer communities developing apps with a relatively open architecture for games and other applications and other things that people find compelling. And that pulls people onto alternative networks. So when people build platforms and try to establish protocols in any kind of tech space now, that's the way they're thinking. How do I pull in independent interest and get people to innovate around my platform? So Bitcoin has a lot of innovation around its platform. There are other platforms that have innovation. Ripple and Ethereum are two that people are interested in. But right now, Bitcoin has an advantage on that. And we've seen that it has a proven ability to exchange value, which is obviously the big deal here. The bigger point, though, and the point that really I think many people in the official communities around the world are now focusing on, is that the underlying technology, the way that my assets in Bitcoin are represented. And I should say, by the way, I'm not a significant investor in Bitcoin. I have no interest in Bitcoin succeeding or failing. I approach this from a completely neutral, from a personal point of view. I'm just trying to explain the technology and how we can use it. So this underlying system of verifying what I own and verifying transactions, that you can use because it's digital. It's a system of digital records. You can use that system to tag any asset and to track who owns what asset and to move asset ownership back and forth. The Bitcoin is divisible. You can also write smart contracts. You can write contracts that automatically determine who gets paid what under particular conditions. You can do that very easily in a Bitcoin system. Bitcoin has relatively low throughput at the moment. You can do 7 transactions per second. There's 10 minutes. The system is set up so that transaction blocks, this is the origin of the word blockchain, the transactions are processed in blocks. It takes 10 minutes on average to process a block. And people who are, I think, pretty sensible in this space wait 40 minutes to confirm transactions. So they wait for 4 blocks to be established for some technical reasons. Now that is obviously very different from, for example, Visa. Visa can handle 2,000 transactions per second. The public record states that their peak potential is 59,000 transactions per second. There's a very big debate within the Bitcoin community about whether they should increase the number of transactions that they can do on their system, for example, but they're a long way from being close to what the credit cards can do. Bitcoin is pseudonymous, not anonymous. There's often a misunderstanding about this. Your identity is, you have an identity on the Bitcoin network. You may disguise that identity, but that identity, the transactions and the holdings of that identity are a matter of permanent record on the Bitcoin network. So one of the key points about distributed ledgers is these are immutable. So with a centralized database, if I control that database and I can get into the database, I may be able to change records of what happened, even a long time ago. You can't do that with this blockchain because it's on these multiple computers, and the computers that system prevents ex post tampering. Law enforcement, I think, is increasingly aware of the pseudonymous point, and the key issue with regard to law enforcement is finding ways in which people who are breaking the law have inadvertently, and this happens quite a lot, provided a link between the pseudonym on Bitcoin and their real identity or their real location. So there's a very active space in terms of technology and in terms of investigations that's proving actually quite appealing to some law enforcement agencies. About 40% of the mining is a term used for the computing power that's used to verify transactions. 40% of that is in China. Why is it in China? Well, our understanding is because the Chinese people running the systems, running computers to verify these transactions, get cheap or free electricity. For example, from large hydro projects that have been built and the industry never showed up to use that electricity. So if you're thinking about this from a geopolitical point of view, which certainly people in the United States do, that's something that's worth keeping in mind. The computing power in the Bitcoin network, nothing is free, right, in the world. So the system is protected by computing power. The network uses over 500 megawatts of electricity. That's about half of a large modern nuclear power station. That's a significant amount of electricity being used to secure $6 billion. And one question that people have is that a good use of resources? What would happen if we scaled it up beyond 6 billion? You would presumably be drawing more computer power into increase the security. So there's some limitations there. The governance of this community is frankly complicated. It's a collective. You need mutual agreement to change the rules, and that makes it very difficult to change the rules. But they have this advantage of open source innovation, and as I said, there are competing blockchains also in development. People make the analogy to the internet in 1994, for example, and I think that there's some validity to that. So I don't know what your first encounter was with the internet, but what I remember seeing seemed interesting but somewhat trivial, not likely to be really mainstream, and also the companies that I first paid attention to, CompuServe or Yahoo and so on, they seem like very powerful companies that had got the technology figured out, and some of those companies are no longer with us, and many of those companies have been eclipsed by people who came along later, building better business models and figuring out how to make the consumer happy, actually. And that's the key to all of this. Now, there's absolutely systemic risks in Bitcoin. I think it's very important to be clear about that. It doesn't have a centralized node that you can capture and hack into, so that's an advantage. My own personal data has been captured recently, both from supposedly secure people, prominent companies in the private sector, and from the US government's website. So I'm very sensitive to this, and I think one thing that we're all interested in is secure digital identities. How do we better protect our data, better protect everything that we do, including in and around government? However, there are other ways to attack this network, and I'd be happy to discuss those when the cameras are not rolling. So let's be careful about that. And Bitcoin itself is a very simple payment technology, but we're now seeing more complex contracts develop, including based on credit, or using Bitcoin in credit transactions and to settle credit transactions. And anytime a system develops in that way, we've got to pay attention. Central banks are not involved. There's no central bank involvement in the Bitcoin network unless central banks wanted to start buying and selling Bitcoins, which I don't think they're about to do. We had problems. If this is like gold, which it is to some degree, we should remember that the gold standard collapsed because as a global system, it had some problems, including those manifest rather dramatically, unfortunately, in the 1930s. What's interesting for government here? Why should you be paying any attention at all? Well, first of all, I told you you can create permanent immutable records. You could use this for land registries. You could use it for other assets. You talked about doing business and the importance of improving everyone's ability to do business. One problem that we have in many, many countries, including the United States, is that if we force people to come to a central location, a government-run node, to handle any kind of transfer of car titles, for example, or anything else, then you're forcing people into an office, into a particular flow of work through a centralized set of computers, and that causes problems. If we could run that in a secure way over a more decentralized network, we're going to get better outcomes. And that's what the Wall Street firms and the very big IT firms are pioneering. And they're demonstrating these. They will develop the technology. They will roll it out for their own operations in and around financial markets, and this technology is going to be available for broader use. You could also use it to track spending. So audit trail, which is a concern, certainly in the university, it's obviously a big concern of government in many ways. What your own ministries spend. So from a point of view of tracking what is spent by spending ministries, tracking if they keep within their budget, tracking in real time compliance with all kinds of rules, this becomes very different, and I think much easier. Instead of information having to flow up through any kind of hierarchy, this is an issue also for big global financial firms. Traditionally, they rely on trader tells his or her boss, boss tells a boss, it goes up to management, management tells the board has a risk committee. You know, we have had a number of pretty spectacular problems with that kind of information flow. This is a system in which the information is available in a decentralized ledger. If you have the key, it's encrypted, but if you have the key that shows what your company is doing or what the agencies are doing, and no doubt the Ministry of Finance gets all the keys in some fashion within the government, then you have the ability to look at real time at all the transactions that are being done, and no one can go back and fiddle with that record or obfuscate it or change it, because that's the permanent record. There are big opportunities here for financial inclusion. Now, I think financial inclusion is not a big, I've only been in Barbados 3 days, but I'm told that financial inclusion is not a particularly difficult issue here. It's a very big issue in the United States. It's a big issue in the UK and lots of other countries. We have 25 million people in the United States who either don't have a bank account or don't have full access to, let's say, standard banking services. They use alternative financial services that are very expensive. And this is related to what people refer to as the very high cost of being poor in the United States. So this is absolutely a way to get at financial inclusion and improve it. And commitment to contingent contracts also becomes easier. This is the point about smart contracts. And I think one of the most interesting developments that you're going to see is related to GDP-linked bonds. Now, as you know, GDP-linked bonds, the idea has been around for quite some time, but investors are often reluctant to buy them because they think, okay, who is going to report the GDP data? Is this going to be accurate? And is the government really going to pay me based on this rule? So this has been an issue in Argentina, this has been an issue in Greece, this is an issue in Ukraine right now, where people have used these. So if you have a digital system of tracking activity in your economy, okay, so I've just expanded the space in which for my digital transactions. But if you have that digital system, and if you record it over a decentralized ledger, then you're not relying on a statistical agency to tell you what economic activity is. That's actually reported in the ledger in a way that's accessible to everyone. And you, as a government issuing debt, can design a contract that says, if the following conditions are met, then we make the payment. And if they're not met, we don't pay. That's a very credible commitment because you're linking that to the transactions that are actually taking place as opposed to somebody's record or what some statistical office may or may not have measured correctly. And okay, so that's reasons for government to care. A couple more points I want to make about the structure of some of these systems. So the piece that's developing on Wall Street, the piece that's going to be coming to you, and the piece that actually I recommend to everyone that you should reach out to the big IT firms and the people developing this technology and talk to them about pilot projects. Talk to accounting firms, talk to firms that build computer systems. They are very interested in thinking about use cases and thinking about how to help solve your kinds of issues. Because if they can find some early adopters, if they can find somebody who would like to try out this technology and show that it works, they can then take that and offer those services to other people. I think it's also, and this is something I want to spend some time on when I'm in Barbados, a great space for local indigenous innovation. People, what should you What would you advise people with software background, interest in financial services to focus on and to go into? And what would you think about fostering in terms of innovation? Permissioned blockchains, private blockchains, in which you have this decentralized network, but it's not the Bitcoin network. That's important. This is a network in which you decide who has permission to be on this. You control that permission perimeter. And as I said, you can choose. Is it the Wall Street banks are going to choose? Is it just the big banks? Is it open to a broader set of financial firms? Does the SEC, also the securities regulator in the US, also allow to be in the permission network? These are design issues that are evolving right now. And I think government must be involved. You shouldn't let the private sector just do this by itself, but you should be involved in a proactive, how do we benefit from this as a government point of view? I'm in favor of innovation and I'm in favor of the private sector taking the lead. I would remind everyone that historically we have had some problems if you let the private sector build complex financial interactions without a central bank. So in the United States, we didn't have a central bank until 1914. There's a lot of suspicion of government, federal government, and actually suspicion of paper money, a long tradition of suspicion of paper money in the United States. And we had a pretty sophisticated financial system up to and through the crisis of 1907. But the crisis of 1907 was one in which, at that point, the banks were doing clearing and settlement among themselves privately on a consortium basis. It was done regionally, but it all flowed up eventually to New York. In 1907, the US financial system almost failed. And it was saved at the very last minute by J.P. Morgan, the man, who, according to the stories, brought all the financial executives into his library in New York, locked the door and put the key in his pocket and said, nobody leaves until we sort this out. Now, I don't think that's the basis for organizing a modern economy, and that was why the realization of how close the US came to a disaster was a big reason why we created a central bank. So I think you do want to be careful when you look at the investments being made by banks, the technology. There's a technology consortium called R3. There's a startup called Digital Asset Holdings. We want to be careful and make sure that we have a role for the central bank as a regulator, yes, as a lender of last resort, absolutely, but that only makes sense if you're also a regulator, so you understand the structure and you understand the risk people are taking. Some of these permission ledgers are also going to prove vulnerable. So there's sometimes we think of cybersecurity. I go to many conversations in the US and in other places where we discuss systemic risk, and we discuss it very broadly. And in some of those conversations, nobody ever brings up cybersecurity. Why? I think these problems are absolutely linked, and you see it very clearly here. And if you build a very high-profile, high-value system in the private sector and the government, you know that somebody's going to want to try and take over that system, somebody's going to try and disrupt that system, somebody's going to try and shut down that system. So we have to think about that, and we need to learn within the community of people who want to be responsible adopters here, and that includes government to government and government to private sector. Yeah, so this is just the point that if we design this right, we'll get a lot more information. But with a lot more information comes a very important analytical task. So right now, if you think about, let's think about financial firms, think about monitoring performance of a big global bank. The data is relatively scarce. It's hard to get your hands on the data, and people spend a lot of time arguing about, the interpretation of little tea leaves about, well, I heard this, and then the CEO said that. So data is scarce, and people focus on getting the data. In a blockchain world, there is a massive amount of data, because every transaction is recorded, and I would like there to be systems that are designed to make as much of that data publicly available as possible, subject to privacy concerns, subject to valid commercial and proprietary interests, of course. I want it to be available to the supervisor of the banks. I want it to be available to the systemic regulator. I think as much as possible should be available broadly to the private sector. Because what you really need is analytics. You need better models to understand what is going on. How do I interpret this data? How do I unpack this enormous flood of data and get a meaningful story out of this? And this will be true for every financial regulator. We'll need to have that kind of ability. And we need to have a lot of innovation by private sector firms to build better analytical tools to understand the network performance and understand where the risks are and understand how those risks are developing. And there's a bunch of technical issues that we can discuss about how these permissioned ledger systems would work. And I would say, by the way, that what we're doing at MIT is absolutely explicitly designed to be open to everyone. We are very neutral in this. We're not backing particular technology or particular companies. We want to share any and all ideas. And if anybody from your government or people working with you wants to come talk at MIT and spend time with us and understand the deep technology side of things, as well as the side I work on, which is more the business economics side, you're very welcome to come and have these very important conversations with us, including about computer security. Now, finally, the central bank issued digital currency. Where does the central bank come into this? Well, I already said I think the central bank should be involved as a regulator. I think you don't want to go to these fully private, sort of pre-1914 type US structures. Those can be vulnerable. And central banks do already issue a digital form of money. That's what it means to have reserves at the central bank. It's just that you have to have a banking license in almost everywhere in order to have access to a digital account at the central bank. But why? Now, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Mr. Broadbent, gave a very nice lecture on Tuesday of this week, in which he laid out a lot of these same issues from a central bank perspective. And the bank, it's a matter of public record that the Bank of England is discussing very broadly with many people, including with us, ways to modernize their what's called the real-time gross settlement system. And as they do that, they want to think about who should be allowed to settle directly through the central bank. Is it just commercial banks? Could it be all financial institutions with a certain kind of license? Could you broaden it out to other trusted intermediaries? Could you even allow individuals in the future to have accounts directly at the central bank? This raises a lot of fascinating issues about how the system would function, what that would do for efficiency. I like to call this a public option for transaction balances. I don't know about Barbados, but in the UK when I was growing up, my mother had a post office savings account for her, and I think I had one. Don't remember what happened to that money. But it was a little book, and you could go into the post office, put money in, take money out. It was a public option for savings. This is a public option for transactions. But it's very close, very analogous in terms of motivation, in terms of providing this option. And, you know, post office savings did not prevent the development of pretty sophisticated financial intermediation and lots of other products through the private sector, but it did give people a safe way to save. And I presume in most cases that these post offices were buying primarily government bonds. So it's a vehicle for channeling individual savings into government bonds. So this is the point about the Bank of England. And the ways in which monetary policy would operate when all cash is digital. Does it give them, some of the thinking is it would give them better tools, more control over the system. It also would fundamentally change banking. And let's be clear about this. And that's why we have to think about it very carefully, because banking is obviously based right now on the idea that banks provide you with liquidity services, you have your deposit at the bank, and the bank funds through a maturity transformation some assets like lending to firms or lending for mortgages. So if the liquidity services are being provided by the central bank, either all the time or in crises, that is a very big change to the banking system, and one we have to think through. And we can talk more about that. Plenty of risks here for the central bank. Who should keep, as I said, who will be trusted to keep the ledger? What happens if there's fraud in one of these access points to the central bank cash? And at least I don't know about in Barbados, but at least in the United States, there's going to be a lot of discussion about, are we making the government too powerful? Because if the central bank has more sway over the financial system, if your bank account is at the central bank, directly or indirectly, the political consequences of that are going to be considerable. And this, I think, in the US will actually be an impediment. So decentralized ledgers, to sort of wrap up, decentralized ledgers don't require trusted intermediaries. The business models and profits are going to be, banks are going to be eroded. We should worry about hybrid versions where we build the central bank cash next to the banking system. That could actually be less stable. And there may be other issues of transition. You know, I think, though, what I would say in conclusion is that ultimately the consumer is in charge. Right? It's the same thing with cell phones. What has prevailed? Why do we use particular kind of cell phones? Well, you use it because you like the features. You use it because you like the strength of the network. But it's mostly about what consumers want, what consumers have chosen to adopt, and the way in which those systems have evolved with some government guidance, but also a lot of private innovation. And I am absolutely convinced that we will end up using almost entirely a mobile money digital cash system. The notes and coins will be regarded by your children and your grandchildren as an amusing curiosity and something that, you know, their grandparents tell stories about. But it's, you know, it's like me trying to explain to my daughter when you had to watch television programs by sitting in front of the TV at a certain time on a certain day, as opposed to being on demand, for example. She has no comprehension about why you would ever do that. It just seems like a strange curiosity. So that's where paper money is going. Now, who's going to offer that digital system? Will it be run through the phone companies? That's M-Pesa in Kenya, for example. Will it be run through the banks, which is the system in Denmark, where cash is already used very, very little and only by older generation? Who else will be allowed to provide access to this system, and what's the role of the central bank? And, whoops, the last slide, we're exploring those issues, but also much more broadly, use of the blockchain technologies, of permissionless ledgers across a range of projects at MIT right now. In payments, securities markets, we're working with the Ministry of Finance in Mexico on distribution of social welfare through this system. And these are all pilot projects where we will share the results with anyone who's interested. How to set up distributed solar power networks running with this kind of payment system. What this implies for trade credit. How do you manage digital identity, which is a huge issue for governments, obviously, and also insurance, how you can improve the efficiency of insurance, regulated insurance in Ireland. So with that, and I'm happy to take any questions or express concerns and tell me what you like and don't like about this vision of a more digital future and what it could imply for government. Thank you very much.
Dr. Johnson, for that very provocative presentation. We have a lot to think about as central bankers and, of course, as civil servants. And as you said, the floor is now open to questions. Don't all jump for the microphone at the same time. Perhaps, though, I could get the ball rolling by asking you if you could share with us briefly the experience in Mexico, for instance, if you have any feedback. As it relates to them using the blockchain technology for social welfare payments.
So in Mexico, we just started the work, and we have a team that's actually going there today. And I'm happy to share updates as they work through that. The basic point and issue, problem to be addressed in Mexico is one of, as I understand it, distributing cash to relatively poor people in quite remote areas. This is a very expensive operation with many risks. And so the government is interested in what would it take to move that piece of what they do to a cashless or digital version. And obviously, I mean, this is, I think, again, things we've learned from the internet and so on. That works if you have an ecosystem around digital cash in relatively remote parts of Mexico, where people can buy and sell, or people can turn digital cash for now into paper cash, right? So what's the holistic approach that you need? Which piece of it can the government initiate? Which private sector partners would you need to bring into it? And the good news is, as I said, private sector is really interested in this because it feels like, I think for good reason, the next new thing. So private sector would like to come and innovate. Private sector would like to put time in. Private sector, I'm not offering, I don't work for any private sector firms. I don't get any commission for this, but I think you can get very good deals from them, maybe even get things for free, because they want to be involved in this early adoption of the technology. And this is a fantastic story, right? If you could really improve the distribution of benefits, if you could address fraud in benefits at the same time as reducing the transaction costs for government, wow, that's a very appealing story. And I think, I mean, you see we've got a range of countries at many different income levels here, and that's because, I mean, that's intentional from us because we think this is potentially valuable for many countries, but also it's because in those places we've got either governments or private sector, interested in this as well. So it's a distributed innovation model around the world that we should think about. Not there's some idea in the United States that's going to spread. It's people have different use cases, different compelling needs in different places, and getting close to that use case and getting a good pilot going, and then figuring out how to develop and roll out technologies is the way forward.
Any questions from the audience? Sure.
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
If you could stand, Cyrus.
Yes, good morning. My question, blockchain technology, which country in the world would you consider to be the leader in the technology, and how did that come about? I mean, what was the kind of like motivation for, and what really were some of the compelling reasons that made that country stand out in terms of the use of the technology?
So a lot of this innovation, so the Bitcoin blockchain idea is rather global, and as I said, there's a lot of the computer mining power is in China. A very large part of that developer community is in the United States, but there's also significant development in Europe, and we think in some other places like China. I think that it's about the venture capital, always, right? So where can you get relatively large amounts of risk capital? It's also about the financial firms. So it's kind of ironic because at the heart of the idea of a permissionless ledger is destroying the business of any trusted intermediary. So banks, you would think, shouldn't want anything to do with this technology because they are the ultimate trusted intermediary. And when you talk to the banks, talk to the people at the banks who've got this vision and who are making these investments, you say, okay, why are you doing this? Because you're going to destroy your business. They say, yes, it's true, but it's going to happen anyway. We want to be part of this and understand where it's going. And this way we'll be better able to change our business model. I think that's a good idea. I think that the existing functions of banks will be fundamentally transformed by this, but there'll still be a role for someone to manage your money and someone to make credit decisions and so on. So it's not that all trust is going to disappear as a key part of the system. So I think though that the phase that we're sort of reflected here is plenty of use cases around the world and plenty of interest in entrepreneurs in solving these problems. We have a very global approach to these issues at MIT, for example. We have a lot of international students and our graduates are spread around the world. So we see ourselves as a bit of a hub for that. But I'm never of the view that the innovation has to be or should be driven just by US use cases. I mean, San Francisco is obviously a big hub for all technology, but it's a very particular, different place in terms of consumer preferences and so on. So I think a lot of it's in the US, but a lot of it is spreading around the world.
Yes, sorry. I have a follow-up question, and perhaps you have answered it just now. I wanted to find out, in terms of technology, innovations, and so on, one of the things that you have to deal with is the whole question of vested interests. And I think you might have mentioned banks as one of them. But besides banks, are there any kind of areas or any type of entities that might be considered, blockers to the technology because of vested interests?
Well, I think that you should always think about vested interests, who would block this. But it's interesting, again, take securities markets. So we have a project with NASDAQ. The Australian Stock Exchange has a project with Digital Asset Holdings, which according to public reports, they will move some of the trading that takes place in Australia through a centralized node onto a permissioned ledger, right? So they'll use that decentralized technology. And I think the idea behind these, let's call them relatively progressive, forward-thinking vested interests, is that if they can run the consortium or decide and be in charge of that permissioned ledger, that's a new, different business compared to running the central node. So they're going to give up the central node to some degree. I mean, this is all pilot basis and presumably to be done in steps, and move to a more decentralized system, but not the full Bitcoin blockchain, because I don't think there's any role for the Australia Stock Exchange in the full Bitcoin blockchain. But for reasons that I talked about, I don't think people are going there anytime soon. We're in a phase of experimentation with the permissioned ledger now. And so I think from a point of view of, if we compare it to other innovations, the advantage here is that there are some of the vested interests are quite intrigued and actually investing. There's also a lot of technology companies that have done really well off internet and everything internet related who can see this coming. And of course, there's a lot of startups who want to challenge the established order.
Yes, good morning. It seems this is a very good initiative that you have here, but what I wanted to find out, this has a lot of benefits for reducing transaction costs, but what would be the impending cost of implementation? If you could drill a little bit more into that and what your experiences have been for other countries too as well. What were the obstacles for implementation as it relates to cost?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that presumably the cost of any building any new system can be significant, but the Bank of England approach is they have this real-time gross settlement system which needs modernizing anyway. Right? So it's a system in which they're going to make investments. And as they're making those investments, and this is what they've said publicly, they would like to design that system. This is an investment they're going to make anyway. They have to make it because the computer, we need to renew all our IT infrastructure on a pretty frequently anyway. But as they modernize it, they would like to build a system that doesn't preclude broader use of central bank digital cash in the way that we were talking about, in the way that Deputy Governor Broadbent talked about this week. So then the question is, what's the incremental cost of adding this broader digital set of possibilities? And I think, I don't know yet, but I think that's going to be relatively small. The Australia Stock Exchange is a fascinating case. I have not seen the numbers on that, but I think, again, it must be in terms of ongoing capital expenditures. Either we upgrade and make better our existing centralized systems, or we take some of that money and instead of upgrading the centralized piece, we build a more decentralized piece. So I'm not sure, you ask me again in 6 months, but I think a lot of this is going to be organic. A lot of it is not. This is not so much a top-down initiative, although I am absolutely saying government should pay attention and government should be involved and government should help design these systems. But this is much more of an organic, bottom-up. There are innovative people and companies, and there's venture capital, and there are incumbents that want to experiment and make change. So I think that people are going to be doing this on a case-by-case, what are we upgrading anyway? Where are we spending? Where's our CapEx anyway? And then how do we sort of move that in a more decentralized direction? And then it's something that, it rolls out over 5 or 10 years, but it's very real. I mean, people are making these investments now.
Hi, good morning. I don't know if I missed it, but I'm just wondering, how would Bitcoins address the issue of digital divide?
Digital divide?
Yes, please.
Okay. By digital divide, do you mean specifically financial inclusion, or more broadly, some people don't have access to digital anything?
More broadly, some persons don't have access to anything digital.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think the most inspiring and encouraging story or experience we have that's relevant to this is actually not Bitcoin, it's M-Pesa in Kenya, the mobile money system, which is, I think runs over smartphones, but not they're feature phones. You just have to be able to send text. Now, it turns out, when they started, a lot of people in Kenya had access to some form of SMS. Now, almost everyone does. And the market penetration, the market share of M-Pesa is extremely high, by some estimates 90% in Kenya. And perhaps they could have done more to develop innovative add-ons. It's not a very open architecture system, so they haven't built a developer community, like as we've seen in some other internet things. But it is still a good system for money transfer and to some limited degree for making payments. So if we take that as an example, and as a vision of digital cash available to many people, but through something digital, and that would be right now it's your phone. I don't know if we'll always have phones or if we implant things in our ears or whatever we do next, right? But we have almost everyone in the world, it turns out, including in pretty remote villages in Africa. I was in Guinea-Bissau not too long ago, and there was a cell phone hanging from a string in the middle of the village. That's the village cell phone, which is used on some shared basis, and I'm not even sure how they charge it because there's no electricity in the village. Someone must have a solar panel. So I think that the financial, I'm not saying it's Bitcoin, but the digital cash and digital future can be built with an inclusion agenda, where financial inclusion then also becomes, to the extent that you build applications around this that are non-financial, that would get at your digital divide. Education gets built onto it, or something about finding work or getting a better price for your product and so on. So I think we've already seen the beginnings of that with the cell phones. I think when we look back, that's what we'll trace it back to historically. I think there's a good reason for government to be involved, for government to set priorities and to where financial inclusion is a big issue. It seems completely legitimate to say, let's make sure we build a system which is for people who don't have much resources, it's an easy-to-use, low transaction cost system. Because that's not what we have in the United States right now. I think it may be what you have in Barbados, but it's not what we have in the United States. In the United States, it's completely divided, and there's a lot of people in many communities who don't have easy access to banking, or for whom banking is too expensive given the amount of money they have and given the kinds of transactions they have. So this seems like a big opportunity to get that, to fix that problem and get that right. And if you can do it with the private sector, fine, even better. And I think there will be people in the private sector who want to build this. To the point about incumbents, I'm not promising that the banks always want to adopt the technology that you want, but there are plenty of other people. Look, the idea of banks and relying on banks for financial services, honestly, it's a little bit of a historical legacy issue. What you really care about financial services is very good IT systems. Right? You want incredibly robust systems that don't crash, people don't lose your money, and they're not susceptible to fraud. So actually, it depends on country by country, and again, I don't know Barbados, but in some other countries, the banks don't run the best IT systems. The best IT systems are run by different firms, including firms that run critical national infrastructure. So I think thinking about that, and thinking about how to bring some competitive pressure on the banks and make sure they do move in the right direction, that's a good thing for government to think about also.
Yeah, good morning. When we look at when the cost of producing oil is high, we get a lot of investment into alternative energy sources. As the cost of oil came down, we hear no more. And you mentioned about chain, we got C7 transactions per minute as compared to Visa 21,000, right? It seems like a pretty wide divide there. Why should government invest in such a technology if we are not seeing the kind of scaling growing up, right? And especially too when you mention of the main nodes being in China, why should our government invest in such a technology going forward?
Well, it's a totally fair question, and I think it's related to this issue of what's the cost and how would you implement it? I vividly remember the first time one of my friends showed me how the internet worked. As a demonstration, he took me to a website where a cat gave personal advice. I mean, really, this did not seem like something that was going to take over the world. And I think that what we've learned over the past, well, long time, but vividly over the past 20 years, is that these digital technologies with a relatively open architecture where a lot of people can add innovation on, they develop very, very quickly. And I don't think the issue is government making investment. I think the issue is government design. Government, just as we heard at the very beginning, government setting priorities, government being involved in design, government looking for use cases within what you do, and to the extent that you have systems that you're upgrading and systems that you are that you are modernizing or thinking about running in a better way anyway, your ordinary run-of-the-mill capital expenditures, looking at more decentralized alternatives. And I think you're going to get very good pricing on these initially if it can be framed as a pilot study and demonstrating what can work. And you can do it with other governments. It doesn't have to be just one place. You can have a consortium of governments that's pushing in that direction. So I'm not saying the government should spend a lot of money, and I'm not saying at all government should invest in Bitcoin. Please don't. I mean, I'm saying that the technology that's come from Bitcoin is being used more broadly at the same time as Bitcoin is putting competitive pressure on money systems. And that broader technology, which people are calling it the blockchain, that technology is going to prove to have very many applications and uses, just like the internet has proved to be much more useful than certainly I imagined and most people imagined at the very beginning. So that's, you still look unconvinced, but that's my point.
Any other questions? Anything from you, Patrick? Okay. All right, we'll take his and then yours, Patrick. And then yours, Patrick.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
My question really is that, is there any concerns that with the new digital currency, that organized crime will be able to launder money? And if they,
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. It's okay. I'll repeat the question. Yeah, the question is a very good one. The use of digital currency to launder money, right? So, look, it's absolutely an important question and a legitimate concern. And you know, there are people who, without question, you know, have used cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, for nefarious purposes and breaking the law and so on. So I think that we need to pay attention to this. And it's a very important priority for law enforcement. I think law enforcement has begun to understand that you can actually follow transactions through the Bitcoin system more readily than was previously supposed. So the criminals are actually creating an immutable, unchangeable record of all their criminal transactions. And in one prominent case where somebody was revealed his identity inadvertently, revealed the link from his real identity to his Bitcoin identity, that enabled law enforcement to unravel not just his criminal activities, but 20 other people he was involved with, including 2 government law enforcement agencies who were receiving corrupt payments, because it was all on the network. Now, I think know your customer anti-money laundering is very important, and I think that's another reason for central banks, for government and for central banks to be involved in this, and to make sure that we have full compliance with that. But I would stress the immutable record point, and actually I think the bigger set of concerns that you will hear people discussing is actually going to be the opposite side of it, which is and you see this, for example, in the discussion right now in the US about the iPhone, right, and whether or not the government can ask Apple to unlock iPhones. So people are going to be increasingly asking, you know, are my data secure against hackers, first of all against the government, and then if the government can get in, some hacker can get in the same window. I mean, that's how they got my data from the US government, right? In supposedly the most secure website, one of the most secure websites of the US government. Well, please, you know. So I think that what you need to have with a digital cash world is a very clear set of rules that are not just laws, but also embedded in the rules of the digital system that govern when law enforcement can see your activities and when they can't. And that has to be the good thing is that will be completely transparent. I think it will run through a judge or whatever your standard means are, but it'll be much more transparent and much more public as a way because it's a question of, you know, when should my encryption key be available to anybody else? And I think, well, that is part of the technology discussion and the policy discussion right now, and that's why we have a project. You notice I didn't say which governments because it's a bit sensitive, but governments, or which parts of government, but governments absolutely, I think the right goal for government is to make sure all individuals have secure digital identities, and they reveal their information in ways that can't then be easily stolen and used for identity fraud. But at the same time, there are legitimate law enforcement circumstances under which law enforcement can have access to many pieces or maybe even all of the information about my transactions through digital cash network. I think that's where but again, that's something that law enforcement everywhere should be involved in that discussion.
Yeah, he virtually asked the question I was going to ask because I wanted to ask what kind of legislative changes we will have to make in Barbados as well as reforms to accommodate, you know, this new type of currency, because we are now moving away from the traditional M1 and M2 definition of money to probably the M3 or M4 definition. And hence, you know, you have to have the correct legislative framework in place. And we also have to be able to track and measure the inflow and outflow of money, because in small open economies like Barbados, you know, the balance of payment is a critical constraint. And we must ensure that, you know, outflows don't exceed inflows. And hence, these are issues in terms of, as I said, legislative reforms, bank and financial sector reforms, economic reform, and so on that we have to undertake. And that is the question I was asking.
Right, so I'm in Barbados to understand your situation, to think about these questions with you. I don't have, ask me again in 2 weeks would be the one answer. I think, though, just sort of based on what I understand now, on the money flow, the balance of payments question, the promise of a system like this is much better access to transaction data in real time for the relevant ministries for the central bank. So actually, you would have a depending on the analytics. Remember, so this now becomes a lot of data, remember? So if you have good analytics, you can see the flows and you can see which way the pressure is building and whether it's anomalous and whether this is just what always happens at Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or whether we have an issue here. Okay? And then presumably you have your various government policies, your various levers, and you also have data on, well, last time we pulled this lever, we adjusted whatever aspect of policy you're adjusting. This is how it affected the financial flow. So you're thinking about policy, and your ability to test policies and monitor policies and to develop policies changes, and I think gets a lot better. In terms of legal framework, I really need to study that more for Barbados. But certainly legal tender. What is legal tender? How do I discharge a debt? So you have a very interesting situation in Barbados, as I understand it currently, which is you allow, both as a government and as and private sector, allow and may be comfortable with the US dollar circulating in parallel with the Barbados dollar so that you can make payments in many places. Either you can offer payment either in US dollar or in Barbados dollars. And if the merchant accepts it, that's an acceptable transaction, subject to, I guess, some rules about making change and so on. So, I think that and many countries don't do that. Many countries are not comfortable with that. Many countries do not. Either the government doesn't allow you to make payments with a parallel currency, or the merchants won't accept it. So you have this interesting, but then the question is, what's legal tender? If I have a debt in Barbados, specified obviously in Barbados dollars, how do I discharge that debt? What can I offer you that you must accept to wipe out the debt? And I think that's a distinct legal and very important legal definition, but I think it's a very precise issue, and it can be addressed in a pretty straightforward way, because you're establishing the validity of a particular form of digital cash tendered in a particular way, and that you're broadening the definition of legal tender. And and that's been done in the past in various ways also when checks were invented, for example, and also when we moved to when we started to allow electronic fund transfer between bank accounts. So again, different ways of offering what is a par value and what people understand to be what it means to have a Barbados dollar, right? And when I offer you a Barbados dollar, what does that mean, and when must you accept it? So it's an important issue, and you've got to get the details right. I don't think that's an insurmountable obstacle.
Any other questions? If there are no further questions, I have the last one for you, Dr. Johnson. Given your prediction of the inevitability of this blockchain technology taking over our lives, especially in relation to payments, what are the 3 things that you think we as civil servants should be thinking about in relation to digital currencies?
Well, I think first of all, don't take my word for it. You should go, talk to the big financial firms, talk to the auditing firms. They're well represented in Barbados. Ask them to have a conference call with their partners that are working on this. Understand it from the private sector point of view. What is being built? Why does it make sense? Secondly, follow the pilots, like this Australian Stock Exchange pilot. We're going to be following it closely. You can follow some of our pilots as well, and think about, okay, what are they doing here? Why does that make sense? Could that work in Barbados? So acquire your own information. And I guess the third thing that you really need is a capacity, which I already discern in the room, people who understand the technology, who think about technology in government, people who are wanting to think about, okay, how do we not spend a lot of money, right? Or never, I would never want, I'm from the IMF, I never want anyone to spend a lot of money, right? Sorry, not from the IMF, I used to work at the IMF. So how do we do this, but in a way that really makes effective use of the public dollar? So that's about technology people. Sometimes we have technology and economics as separate issues in our official world, and they've got to be very integrated here, because you need people who understand the technology and who can make an assessment of the sensible technology possibilities here, and people who can think about what makes sense in terms of organization of government and in doing business. How do we make it easier for the private sector to do business Because everything that Patrick said about your national priorities, I think is going to line up very well with this if you design it right and if you get those details right. So you need a capacity, a local capacity in the ministries, in the central bank. Presumably you can do this together, that's able to make those kinds of decisions or make recommendations to the responsible ministers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson, for sharing your knowledge with us on blockchain technology. I'm sure we're much the richer this morning, much more educated in relation to this new technology. And I want to say thank you for my colleagues in the civil service for taking your Friday morning off to spend with us here at the Central Bank of Barbados. We are delighted to have Dr. Johnson with us. He's our third distinguished visiting fellow, the two previous ones being Fred Bergston, who was the founder of the Peterson Institute. Dr. Johnson is now currently a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute, and then a Caribbean man, Dr. Peter Blair Henry, who was with us last year. Dr. Johnson is going to be spending much of March with us, and this is but one of the many conversations he'll be having with various groups in Barbados. But I would like to encourage you to tune in to CBC TV 8 and, or Trident Television next week. CBC TV 8 on the 8th at 8:05 p.m. when he will be in conversation with Dr. Worrell on a variety of issues, including digital currencies, his life and work at the IMF, what's happening in the global economy, what happened in 2008, etc., as well as note it in your diaries or in your phones, March the 22nd, when we have our flagship event, which is the Caribbean Economic Forum, and on that occasion, he will be in dialogue with Julian Rogers, veteran Caribbean journalist Julian Rogers, on a plethora of issues, and that begins 8 o'clock Barbados time, and we will be engaging him until 9:30 in the evening. So thanks once again, and spread the word about blockchain technologies. And Patrick, you have a lot of work to do with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Finance, but I'm sure you're up to the challenge. And thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.